Hello there, and welcome to my Brackenhide Hollow Mythic Dungeon Guide. In this video, I'll extensively cover the abilities of all enemies you will face in a Brackenhide Hollow run. Brackenhide is yet another difficult and long dungeon among the Season 2 lineup. That said, it has gone through a few changes since its first iteration. I'll be making a dungeon guide on all 8 of the slated Mythic Plus dungeons for Dragonflight Season 2. I'll also be uploading a recap video every week where I discuss the cool new tips and tricks I've discovered over the week. If you want to catch either of those, be sure to subscribe. Just like with my previous guides, I'll be marking important or impactful mob abilities in red and less important abilities in green. Additionally, I'll be marking out abilities with their associated counterplay, including magic effects, enrages, curses, interrupts, bleed for Draktheirs, and poisons or diseases. Let's begin. I'll preface the dungeon by saying that you should probably pay attention to all the mobs, as some mobs you see in this first area are present in later parts of the dungeon. So you start the dungeon at the shores of the Knoll hideout Brackenhide Hollow. This first area is large and contains a significant number of enemies. Fortunately, there are only a handful of unique enemies. An important detail to note about gnolls, the main enemies you fight in this area, is that they run away when they're low. This can be dangerous as they could pull other mobs when they flee, so you should be careful of your positioning here. To progress past this first area to the boss, you'll need to save 5 trapped Tuskars in cages. There are 7 potential cages to open, and you only need to open 5. Because of this, you'll need a route planned beforehand. The first pack you may face contains 3 mobs, the first of which is the Bone Bolt Hunter. The Hunter has quite a few abilities, with their primary ability, Shoot. They don't spam it, but they cast it fairly frequently. It just does damage to the tank. Their second ability is Bone Bolt. They shoot it at a random party member, and it deals some damage and applies a bleed. This bleed stacks, so if you're fighting multiple hunters, one player can get multiple stacks of this bleed. Each stack of this bleed also increases the damage of future bone bolts on that target. So if you have 6 stacks of the bleed and you're shot by another bone bolt, you're probably instantly dead. Their last ability is called Toxic Trap. After a cast, they will throw a trap at a player. Stepping into the trap deals a lot of damage to you and leaves behind a large toxic pool. Next to the Hunter is going to be a Vicious Hyena. The Hyena only casts one ability. It's called Infected Bite, and is cast on the tank. It reduces the healing received of the tank by 15% for 12 seconds. It has no cast time, so tanks will have to be careful here. Last in this initial pack is the Cruel Bone Crusher. They cast 2 abilities, the first of which is Bloody Bite, a short cast melee hit on a random player that applies a bleed. The bleed lasts 15 seconds, but it is removed if the player is above 90% health. This makes it so if the healer falls behind on healing, it becomes much more difficult. They also cast Crushing Smash on the tank, dealing some damage and applying a 30% slow for 12 seconds. Here you may choose to go down a small ramp to the left and unlock a small cage down a slope. You will face your first new enemy, the Trickclaw Mystic. The Mystic only spams Earth Bolt, dealing damage to a random player. They will spam this, so if you want to bring them into melee for better cleave, you'll want to interrupt them. Game files mention an ability called Focus Earth, which grants them a 20% damage buff. I didn't see it on PTR, but here it is just for reference. Alone, that's all they do. But in future packs, there will be a mob that summons a totem called the Rot Chanting Totem. If the Mystic is near the totem, they will be able to cast Witherbolt, a direct damage ability that applies Withering. Withering is the most deadly mechanic in this first area. Withering is a disease effect that lasts 45 seconds, and you gain 1 additional stack of it every 5 seconds. Because of how dangerous it is, you'll want to use interrupts on it at all costs. If you are affected by Withering, when you have Withering, the duration extends but the stacks don't reset. This means you could potentially have 45 seconds of the full 10 stacks of Withering. This makes this dungeon basically impossible at higher keys unless you have a disease clear, or if you have an alchemist, something I'll discuss later on. Down the hill are more enemies, and one very important unique enemy, the Bracken Warscourge. They have a lot of abilities. The first is Pack Tactics, an AoE aura that grants all nearby enemies a 15% damage buff, in addition to reducing enemy cooldowns by 25%. Quite deadly, and disincentivizes pulling large packs with this guy. This effect stacks, so you really don't want to pull multiple of these things. The Warscourge typically starts a pull by casting Rage Storm, where they spin like a warrior. You'll want to step out of it, or if you have a Soothe, soothe it. Soothing it stops it instantly. The Warscourge normally follows it up with Bloody Bite, the same one we saw earlier. Bloody Bite stacks, by the way, so healers will really need to focus players affected by it. And finally, The War Scourge will probably follow it up with Hideous Cackle. A long cast which, if you don't interrupt it, will fear every player for 4 seconds. This can potentially fear you into other packs, so you really want to interrupt this. This is priority number 1. Past all those mobs, you fight the last unique enemy in this area, the Decay Speaker. The Decay Speaker primarily casts Decay Surge on the tank, dealing some damage. When you first pull them, and occasionally throughout their lifetime, they will summon the Rot Chanting Totem. The Rot Chanting Totem buffs every nearby Mystic to be able to cast Witherbolt, as mentioned earlier. When these totems spawn, you want to focus them down immediately. They're totems, so you have to use single target abilities on them. And finally, the Decay Speaker casts Withering Burst. This will spawn a circle around a player, and after a few seconds it explodes. Any players caught in that circle will receive Withering. You'll want to interrupt it, but if you miss the interrupt, make sure you're not stacking and cleanse it immediately. There's one more mechanic in this first area, and that will be present for the whole dungeon. It's called the Decaying Cauldron. There are several cauldrons around the area, and an Alchemist level 25 can interact with it. After the Alchemist fixes the pot, everyone can use it. And if you do use it, you get 1 charge of an extra action ability that cleanses all disease effects on you. This makes it so you don't have to have a disease cleanser in your party, but I would still recommend at least bringing one when you're doing this dungeon. After freeing 5 of the 7 trapped Tuskars, you can finally make your way to the first boss. The first boss is a fight that involves 3 units, each fairly different from each other. There's a lot of mechanics here, so bear with me. To start with, this boss has a mechanic called Prey on the Weak. For every 10% health missing from players, they will gain a stack of Predatory Instinct, increasing their haste by 10%. So if everyone's at 89% health, they will have a 50% haste buff. This fight is very strenuous on your healer, and puts a lot of emphasis on DPS not to take avoidable damage. The first of the 3 and the biggest is Rira Hackclaw. Hackclaw has 3 abilities. Their basic attack cleaves in front of them, so don't stand behind the tank. Hackclaw may cast Blade Storm, dealing significant damage to players in a small AoE. You'll want to step out of this circle and kite it, as the boss does chase 1 player. And finally, Hackclaw's ultimate. Hackclaw will cast Savage Charge at a random player. After 8 seconds, they will charge at that player. If the tank is not between Hackclaw and the player, that player will instantly die. So be very careful. Other players should also make sure you're not between Hackclaw and the player. The second boss is the rogue Gashtooth. Gashtooth is fairly dangerous. Gashtooth starts the fight by casting Gash Frenzy, jumping behind all players once, each time doing a lot of damage and applying a bleed that lasts 45 seconds. This bleed is similar to Bloody Bite from earlier, in that it will be dispelled if the player is over 90% health. That is a lot of healing for your healer to do. Gashtooth also has a fixate through Marked for Butchery. It lasts 4 seconds and Gashtooth will hit that player 8 times over that duration. This does a ludicrous amount of damage. You have to use the defensive for this or you will die. Healers generally can't react that fast to that much damage. And finally, Gashtooth may cast Decayed Senses at the tank. This deals some damage and blinds them. While blinded, the tank will take 150% more physical damage. Fortunately, while the tank is blinded, Gashtooth will stand there doing nothing. Healers will want to dispel this blind as fast as possible. That may prove to be difficult because of the third enemy, Trick Totem. Trick Totem is the caster and has 3 abilities. The first is the ultimate, Hex Trick Totem. They will summon a totem that will incapacitate the healer. You'll need to break the totem to break the healer out. Thing is, this totem normally lines up with Decayed Senses, so while the healer is incapped by the totem, the tank is blinded by Decayed Senses. That means the healer cannot dispel the tank. So the party has to focus down the totem as fast as possible, or bad things start to happen. If you have a priest or warlock DPS, they could dispel the tank, and they should if they can. Otherwise, Trick Totem only casts Earthbolt, dealing direct damage to a random player. While not deadly, it can be disruptive to other abilities, so interrupt this when you can. And finally, Trick Totem has a big ability called Healing Rapids, which, if not interrupted, will heal a random enemy for a lot of health and apply a healing buff, which you should dispel if you miss the interrupt. And finally, for this fight, when any of the bosses hit 30% health, they will all receive Bloodlust, a 30% haste and damage buff for the rest of the fight. That means you'll want to ideally bring them down equally. This fight is hard. I expect nerfs at some point in the season. Okay, we finally make our way past the first area. I would like to say it gets easier from here, but it doesn't. Here you can choose a path, to go either left or right. The left has mostly to do with bleeds and the right disease. I think bleed is a bit more unavoidable than disease, so I would normally opt to go right. I'll talk about both, but I'll talk about right first. The right path has 7 unique enemies. The first and easiest is the Decaying Slime. They don't cast anything, but they leave behind a puddle of decay upon death. Just don't stand in the puddle. The second is the Brackenhide Shaper. The Shaper primarily summons Lashers, spawning 2 of them. They also cast Touch of Decay, dealing direct damage to a random player, which should be interrupted. And just like with the first area, there are mobs that summon totems. If the Shaper is buffed by a totem, it can cast Infuse Corruption, applying Withering 3 times to one selected player. Next is the Tree the Decayed Elder. A common theme among mobs in this area is that they summon Lashers. The Elder is no different and also summons Lashers. They only cast one other ability quite infrequently, Decaying Roots at a random player. It immobilizes that player and deals some damage. It also reduces haste by 10%, so healers should dispel this as fast as they can. Let's talk about the Lashes for a minute. These Lashes spawn in large numbers, but they don't do very much. They occasionally jump to a random player and apply a bleed that stacks. This can be dangerous if there are large numbers of them, so you'll want to burst them down quickly. The big boy mob in this area is called the Wilted Oak. They repeatedly spawn a new set of Lashers every 12 seconds while alive. Their first real ability is Stomp, where they stomp in a pretty large AoE. You'll want to step out of it or get stunned for 5 seconds. Their other ability is Necrotic Breath, an interruptible frontal that does a lot of damage. It also applies a disease effect that reduces healing received. Of course, you don't have to use a kick here, you can just sidestep it. The important mob in this area is the Fetid Rotsinger. You can compare them to the War Scourges seen earlier, as they also have pack tactics. These mobs are the ones that summon the totem in this area. It's very slightly different from the earlier totems. This totem repeatedly pulses, and if you don't kill it before it pulses, it applies Withering to all players. You'll want to focus this down. The Rotsinger may also cast Burst of Decay, dealing significant damage to a target and any players nearby. You probably want to interrupt this. And finally, is a large mob that's not very dangerous, the Monstrous Decay. They occasionally cast Gushing Ooze on their current target, the tank. It's just a dot that needs to be healed through. When the slime hits 20% health, they will cast Burst, destroying themselves and splitting into 3 decaying slimes. Killing it before it completes this cast will stop the damage, but the slimes will still spawn. And that's it for this area. It's actually pretty easy. I think you can pull really big in this area. You fight through a whole bunch of these mobs and finally make your way to the second boss, Treemouth. Treemouth is fairly simple. His first ability is a frontal tank hit. It deals damage and knocks you back, so tanks face this away from your party. Treemouth then may cast a Decay Spray at a random player. It tracks the player, and when it finishes, spawns 4 slimes near that player. These slimes are fairly similar to the one seen earlier, except they also cast Gushing Ooze, dealing some damage in a small AoE around them. Not very dangerous, really. When the boss hits 100 energy, they will begin sucking in all players for 4 seconds. You don't want to be near him when he finishes it. At the end, he will try to consume all players near him. The thing is, you want one player to be eaten by him, because if you don't, he'll get the Starving Frenzy buff, an enrage which basically means you wipe. So you should designate one player to be consumed. When that player is eaten, they'll be in the belly for 10 seconds, taking some damage during that time. The party can break the player out early by breaking the shield the boss receives. When the player is spit out, you will have a debuff called Partially Digested. This will make it so you take 200% more damage from consume for a minute. This means that you want to alternate who gets eaten. A good way to do it is for the tank to go first, a DPS go in with a defensive, tank again, another DPS with a defensive, tank again, etc, etc. Consume is physical damage, so Blessing of Protection can work here. The boss has one more ability called Infectious Spit. It's an instant cast that slows a player by 10% for 20 seconds. I didn't see it in my testing, but here it is for reference. As mentioned earlier, you can go left or right, so I'll briefly talk about the mobs you see when going left. You will meet the familiar Bone Bolt Hunters you've seen earlier, but you may also come across a new mob called the Gut Stabber. The Gut Stabbers can be fairly annoying, jumping to a random player and applying a 40% haste slow. You'll need to use a Poison Cleanse for this. Honestly, we've seen a lot of the mobs here already. Cruel Bone Crushers, Bone Bolt Hunters, and Vicious Hyenas. One new mob you might see is the Rotbow Stalker. The Stalker has several abilities. The first and most dangerous is Bone Bolt Volley. The name is exactly what it is. He will shoot a Bone Bolt at all players. This does a lot of damage and it stacks, so be very, very careful. If you pull multiple Stalkers at the same time, you're probably going to wipe. These stalkers also have pack tactics, so be careful. Their only other ability is Scented Meat. They'll throw the meat at a random player, dealing some damage and applying a dot. For 10 seconds, all nearby beasts, including vultures, hyenas, and bears, will fixate on that player, so that player will need to kite aggressively. Slows and stuns can be useful here. Speaking of the bear, the Gutshot bear is very simple. They only cast Maul, a hard-hitting tank buster. It has a 2-second cast time, so there's plenty of time to react to it. I don't have footage to show you this, but on the left path is a lone war scourge standing between some traps. They're not alone. They're surrounded by 6 gut stabbers. Approach him very carefully, as the gate behind you does close if you go and fight him. You may also encounter a Flesh Ripper Vulture. They only cast Screech, an interruptible ability that does damage to all players. You have to interrupt this. That's all the unique mobs you should face between the second and third boss. There are a couple of unique enemies that I will highlight here. There is a shortcut between boss 2 and boss 3, and on the shortcut there is one unique enemy called Stink Breath. Stink Breath is actually fairly dangerous with his ability Stink Breath. He will target a random player and spit in their direction. This disorients all players in a frontal cone. The targeted player cannot dodge this, and the healer cannot dispel this either. So try and make a formation around Stink Breath so that you're the only one hit by it if you are targeted by it. Stink Breath also casts Violent Whirlwind. It's just Blade Storm that knocks you back. Just step out of it. There is one more unique mob that you will almost never pull. It's called Rageclaw. Rageclaw is a bear standing alone in the middle of an arena. I don't have footage to show you, but they have 3 abilities. The first is Feral Claw, a tank buster. The next is Bloodthirsty Charge, a short wind-up on a random player that will knock back and deal damage to all players in its path. This also applies a bleed to the primary target. Spread out for this. And finally, at 20% health, the bear will cast Bloody Rage, increasing attack, damage, and speed by 100%. You'll want to soothe this. Those are all the unique mobs you encounter on the way to the third boss. Gutshot is a boss fight that revolves around the boss continuously summoning 2 hyenas throughout the fight. The boss starts with 2 to begin with, and the fight normally starts with her spawning 2 ensnaring traps. 2 players will be marked, and after a few seconds drop a trap beneath them. Don't step on these traps as you'll need them for the next mechanic. The boss may cast Meat Toss on a random player, causing the hyenas to fixate on that player. This will grant all active hyenas an enrage that grants them 100% more damage dealt. The player targeted should kite the hyenas into the traps, snaring them for a good amount of time, allowing your other DPS to damage them down and kill them. If any hyenas are trapped, the boss will try to cast Master's Call. If the boss successfully finishes the cast, all hyenas will be immune to snares and roots. You'll want to interrupt this. Other than that, the hyenas only have a couple of abilities. Crippling Bite is a tank buster that reduces healing received. The hyenas may occasionally cast Bounding Leap, jumping to random players, dealing damage when they land, just sidestep it. As for the boss herself, she casts Gutshot, a tank buster which knocks back. Tanks will really want to be careful not to get knocked back off the cliff. It has happened to me before. And finally, just like some of the mobs earlier, this boss is pack tactics, causing her and her hyenas to do more damage. That's it. There are 2 potential paths you can take here to the last boss. One from Treemouth and one from Gutshot. Treemouth's path is a bit more dangerous because it's a gauntlet, in the sense that an infinite amount of Wither Biters will spawn as you do the gauntlet, and they only stop once you reach the end. However, the mobs you face on both sides is exactly the same, so I won't be elaborating too much on the gauntlet. In this video, I'll be going to the last boss through Gutshot. Witherlings are grunts, they do nothing. Wither Biters, the mobs that infinitely spawn in the gauntlet, only cast Bloody Bite, an ability we have seen earlier. The first non-grunt mob is the Disease Slasher. They cast 2 abilities, the first is Bloody Bite again, and the second is Decay Claws, a tank buster that applies a large heal absorb. Tanks will need to be careful. The next mob is the Vile Rot Hexer, with their deadly ability, Withering Contagion. This deals damage in a 5-yard radius, and will spread to all players that come in contact with that player. It does some damage and reduces your damage done by 20%. You'll want to use a Disease Cleanse. However, at some point, the Rot Hexer will cast Siphon Decay, which deals damage to the whole party, and will buff the Rot Hexer. The Rot Hexer removes all Withering Contagion off players, and grants themselves a 5% physical damage buff for every stack they cleanse. While the removal of the Withering Contagion is welcome, the buff that the mob gets is not. A few packs may also contain the Filth Caller. They only cast 2 abilities. Decay Surge is a direct damage projectile cast on the tank. They also cast Rotting Surge, leaving behind several swirlies around the ground for 5 seconds. While not super dangerous, it is annoying for your ranged casters, so be careful. And that covers every single trash mob in this dungeon. And now we make our way to the last boss. Be careful with this boss, as there's this one mob that patrols quite close to the boss arena that you might want to kill ahead of time, as it is always dangerous when you get a random trash mob during the boss fight. As for the boss herself, she has quite a few abilities and they're all quite dangerous. This fight is particularly punishing for players who take a lot of avoidable damage. When you pull the boss, a large cloud of disease will cover any area that's not considered the boss arena, so be sure to be in the boss arena when pulled. The boss normally starts the fight by casting Choking Rot Cloud, summoning a cloud of rot that grows in the direction of the tank. It rotates clockwise around the room, so you'll want to make sure you're not standing in it, as standing in it applies a stacking debuff in the form of Withering Rot. Each stack reduces your damage dealt by 5%. The boss often follows this cloud up with Decay Strike, dealing significant damage to your tank and applying a large heal absorb. This is dangerous, more so for tanks without good self-healing. Healers need to be careful here. Then the boss may cast Rotburst Totem. The totem spawns and will immediately try to spam cast Rotting Burst. If successful, the totem will apply Withering Rot on all players. You don't want that to happen, so you want to focus it down as fast as you can. There is only one way to remove stacks of Withering Rot, and you will not like how it's done. When the boss reaches 100 energy, she will cast Decaying Strength, a long cast where she will siphon Withering Rot off all players. That's great. This will spawn a few swirlies around all players, so just don't overlap. Upon finishing the cast, all players lose their Withering Rot stacks, and the boss gains 1 stack of Decaying Strength for each Withering Rot she siphons. Each stack of Decaying Strength increases her damage dealt by 5% for the rest of the fight. The part that makes this fight really difficult, or at least that's how it was on PTR, the boss's energy doesn't go up if she has stacks of Decaying Strength. This means the longer the fight goes, the more stacks she gets. The more stacks she gets, the longer it takes for her to cast her ultimate. The longer it takes for her to cast her ultimate, the more stacks of Decaying Rot you get. It's a vicious cycle that makes the DPS check on this fight quite high. That's all the mechanics for this boss though. Oh, one last thing, the boss dies at 10%, not at 0. So you don't have to go all the way down to 0. And with that, we're at the end of the dungeon. Some of these bosses are hard, like really hard. Harder than any other boss, I think, in Season 2. I'm not sure I'm entirely looking forward to playing it, but at least the trash looks fun. I make these videos to give players a full overview of dungeons, as I like to be well informed of dungeon mechanics myself. I hope this was helpful. If you liked it, leave a like or subscribe, and I'll see you in my next dungeon guide.